Today, I'd like to talk about music and tyranny, or more specifically, Dmitri Shostakovich's relationship with Joseph Stalin and with those of the dictator charged with implementing his artistic policies in respect of the production of classical music in the Soviet Union. This is really a story in two chapters. The later chapter takes place after the Second World War, in the final years of Stalin's dictatorship, during that last terrifying burst of paranoia that will conclude with the so-called doctor's plot. Using the excuse that his Jewish doctors were planning to kill him, Stalin planned the ultimate Russian pogrom against the Jewish community within the Soviet Union. At the same time, he was bringing Russian artists to heel, demanding that they follow the party's chosen aesthetic, socialist realism. However, it's an earlier chapter in the story of Stalin's tyranny that I want to talk about today, and that belongs to the 1930s, when the dictator was tightening his grip on absolute power. Leaving aside, if one can, the terror of the unannounced knock on the door in the middle of the night, which is common to most 20th century European dictatorships, the arbitrary arrest and the nightmarish journey to the headquarters of the Gestapo or the NKVD, the immediate tyranny that dominated the relationship between artists and the state in the early 20th century, be it the Soviet or the Nazi states, is surely the idea that the state can and should decide what art ought to be. And so the notion of individual creativity, to compose, to write, to paint as the artist wishes, a cherished freedom within the idea of liberal democracy, is denied. The only permitted art is that which serves the ideological purposes of the state. In the case of the Soviet Union, art that follows the precepts of socialist realism. But we might remember for a moment that the concept of absolute artistic freedom is a relatively new one, born perhaps out of that extraordinary shift in sensibility that we call Romanticism, in which the poet, painter or composer, rather than occupying a recognised position within society, is reconstructed as an outsider. Thus Shelley's celebrated claim in his defence of poetry that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. From that perspective, earlier modes of cultural production can also be seen as versions of tyranny, even if somewhat more benign than that of Hitler or Stalin or latterly Mao. For example, the tyranny of whoever held the purse strings, be it Louis XIV as Lully's patron, or the Duke of Chandos and Handel or Haydn and Prince Nicholas Esterhazy. The point I would make is that within the Western musical tradition there has always perhaps been a tension between the creative aspirations of the artist and the demands of the patron. The person who calls for the tune, after all, pays the piper. We might also reflect that this tension finds its way into the music, sometimes for ill, but sometimes for good. Two examples from Shostakovich's output perhaps make my point. The majestic Seventh Symphony, the Leningrad Symphony, and then The Sun Shines Over Our Motherland, a cantata for boys' choir, mixed chorus and orchestra, which had its first performance in November 1952 to celebrate the 35th anniversary of the revolution. The composer Khachaturian, a master of sarcasm, described this cantata as the apotheosis of a major triad. On January the 26th, 1936, Joseph Stalin and his entourage went to the opera. They chose the musical hit of the moment in Moscow, hailed by critics and admired by professional musicians. In the first months of the new year, there were opportunities to see 3 different productions of Shostakovich's new opera, Lady Macbeth of the Mosens district, within the Soviet capital. And Stalin chose to see the production of the Bolshoi, with the composer on hand in the theatre should the great leader wish to see him during or after this hugely successful work. The performance itself went well, but Stalin and his entourage left the theatre before the end of the opera. Then, 2 days later, came the celebrated article in Pravda, "Muddle instead of music," dictated, some say, by Stalin himself. Several theatres have presented to the culturally maturing Soviet public Shostakovich's opera Lady Macbeth of the Potenz district as a novelty, as an accomplishment, it declared. Fawning musical criticism extols the opera to the heavens, trumpeting its fame. Instead of practical and serious criticism that could assist him in his future, the young composer hears only enthusiastic compliments. Then came the bombshell. From the very first moment of the opera, the listener is flabbergasted by the deliberately dissonant, muddled streams of sound. Snatches of melody, embryos of a musical phrase, drown, struggle free, and disappear again in the din, the grinding, and the squealing. To follow this music is difficult, to remember it impossible, and so on and so forth. The opera was guilty of petty bourgeois formalism, of turning its back on a simple, accessible musical language, of rejecting the genuine, simple art that was demanded by the masses. As one of Shostakovich's recent biographers writes, he was down overnight from the summit as the brightest star among young Soviet composers to the abyss as a pernicious purveyor of cultural depravity. And these were terrible times in Stalin's Soviet Union, whether you were in the abyss or on the summit. What Robert Conquest christened the Great Terror was about to begin. In September 1936 came the first show trial, the trial of the old Bolsheviks, former party leaders. 16 members of the so-called Trotskyite, Kamenevite, Zinovievite, leftist countercultural revolutionary bloc, including Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, were accused of being involved in the assassination of Sergei Kirov, the party boss of Leningrad, who was almost certainly murdered on Stalin's orders, and also with plotting to kill Stalin. The dictator had always been suspicious of Leningrad and its cultural independence. After confessing to the charges, all were sentenced to death and executed. We now know that their confessions were secured only after they'd been tortured, and often on Stalin's direct orders. In the course of the terror that followed, hundreds of thousands of victims were accused of various political crimes: espionage, wrecking, sabotage, anti-Soviet agitation, conspiracies to prepare uprisings, and coup. They were quickly executed by shooting, that's if they were lucky, or they were sent to the Gulag, where many died in its penal labour camps from starvation, disease exposure, and overwork. The most recent estimate suggests that between 1937 and 1938, just 1 year, 950,000 to 1.2 million people perished. No family was untouched by this terror, and Shostakovich's was no exception. By the spring of 1937, the composer's brother-in-law had been arrested, his sister exiled to Central Asia, and his mother-in-law sent to a labour camp. The composer's closest friend in the Leningrad NKVD, a music lover, had been arrested, and another influential friend, the soldier, Marshal Tukhachevsky, was tried and executed as part of the purges of the Soviet armed forces in June 1937. And the composer himself was called in by the Leningrad NKVD to explain his connection with the Marshal. He was spared, he told friends, from further interrogation when his inquisitor was himself arrested. How was Shostakovich to deal with the criticism made against his music in Pravda? Firstly, you keep your own counsel, for it was clear, as his most recent biographer argues, that the idealistic vision of Soviet music informed by cosmopolitan sophistication was no longer possible. So, Shostakovich withdrew the huge Mahlerian Fourth Symphony that he was composing at the time of the Pravda editorial after first rehearsals with the Leningrad Philharmonic. It's likely that he was faced with an unappetizing choice. If he didn't withdraw a symphony that was evidently guilty of formalism, then it would be banned, with all the public consequences of that decision being visited on the composer and his family, loss of privileges and loss of income being the mildest. So then, how to square the impossible circle of being honest to yourself while also meeting the needs of the society, or rather the state. The result here was the controversial Fifth Symphony, given its first performance in Leningrad in November 1937. In an article published a few days before the premiere, the new work was described as a Soviet artist's response to just criticism. Whether those were the composer's words or were coined by an apparatchik, we can never be certain. The symphony is non-programmatic, it's in 4 movements, and as the brief first programme note declared, it was a lengthy spiritual battle crowned by victory. Did the ambiguity of that description and the non-specific nature of the music allow Shostakovich to somehow sidestep tyranny? Was the spiritual battle personal, or was it the battle of the people in their search for the true socialist way? If it was personal, was the composer musing on just criticism, or a man suffused with melancholy for all that was happening around him in Soviet Russia? And the victory? Was this the people's victory, the upward, onward surge of the revolution, with the composer now marching shoulder to shoulder with his fellow Soviet citizens, or even something simply as vague as the triumph of the human spirit in adversity? Or perhaps in the heroic final movement of the Fifth Symphony, Shostakovich is mocking the banal and mendacious optimism which Soviet propaganda had wrapped around Stalin's Russia. Not until his Fifth Symphony had been vetted by the party and the professional musical community, as well as the public, did the composer break his silence, with 2 statements released the same day in the following January. He hinted that the symphony was autobiographical, taking its subject the suffering of man and all-conquering optimism. I wanted to convey in this symphony how, through a series of tragic conflicts, of great inner spiritual turmoil, optimism asserts itself as a worldview. On the same day, he also said, "There is nothing more honourable for a composer than to create works for and with the people." It's perhaps only in the West that we would regard these 2 statements as being completely incompatible, making, as we do, an essential distinction between the idea of the public and the notion of the private. For if one thing seems clear after the huge success of the Fifth Symphony, it is this, that Shostakovich had found his own way of being his own man and, at the same time, a loyal son of the revolution. And we shouldn't doubt that Shostakovich was committed to the ideals of the revolution. From a Soviet perspective, he had an honourable radical pedigree. His great-grandfather had taken part in the Polish Rising of 1830, when Poles had sought independence from Russia, while his paternal grandfather had been exiled to Siberia in 1866 following an attempt on Tsar Alexander II's life. One of the saddest consequences of the Pravda editorial is that it effectively ended Shostakovich's career as an opera composer. Indeed, it's tempting to think that the debacle over Lady Macbeth of the Tenth District had taught Shostakovich a way of now covering his true tracks. Pretend that you're hard at work on the kind of music that the ideologues and the apparatchiks who control the Union of Musicians want to hear, and they will leave you alone. What the party wanted was symphonies in the grand Beethoven mould that moved from dark to light, from trouble to triumph, the instant history of the Soviet Union itself. And here we should consider another commonly expressed view of Shostakovich's music, namely that in the symphonies he pays his party dues, and in his chamber music he pleases himself, often voicing his true feelings about the political times he was living through, while exploring that strain of melancholy which everyone who knew him comments on. However, I'm sceptical about the idea that we should read any of Shostakovich's music in exclusively political or exclusively personal terms, even autobiographically. Music doesn't work really like that. Even the most tightly programmed music slips away from the Pacific. How do we know that it really is a portrait of Stalin in the second movement of the 10th Symphony, and not simply music that listening to its white-knuckled fury has you gripping the arms of your chair. As Shostakovich himself said in that much-disputed memoir Testimony, you see how hard it is to draw the image of leaders and teachers with music. In 1955, having suffered again at the hands of the ideologues within the Union of Musicians, notably that most grisly of time servers, Tikhon Khrennikov, Shostakovich quoted a passage from Chekhov that puts much of this debate into perspective. It is the duty of writers to accuse, not to prosecute, Chekhov wrote, but to champion even the guilty once they have been condemned and are enduring punishment. Great writers and artists ought to take part in politics only so far as they have to protect themselves from politics. There are plenty of accusers, prosecutors and gendarmes without them. So what does music by Shostakovich, the music we've chosen for this programme, tell us about the composer, about politics and tyranny? Let's begin with some more politics. The story that Shostakovich was there at the Finland station in Petrograd when Lenin arrived in Russia's second city in April 1917 is entirely apocryphal. For one thing, the train didn't arrive in the station until after 11 p.m, and it was almost an hour before Vladimir Ilyich made his historic appearance on top of an armoured car. But young Shostakovich was a child of Lenin's revolution, and he bought into the excitement that it provoked in artistic and intellectual circles in Leningrad in the 1920s, when for a few years it seemed the city would be an epicentre of all that was shocking and new in the arts. That almost golden age when Anatoly Lunacharsky, Lenin's first Soviet People's Commissar of Enlightenment, responsible for culture and education, seemed to positively encourage the destruction of traditional ideas about art. This is the age of constructivism and suprematism, of the painters Malevich, Tatlin and Rodchenko, the filmmakers Eisenstein and Vertov, and in the theatre Meyerhold. This was the time when at the age of 16 Shostakovich composed his Piano Trio No. 1 in C minor in 1923. It was a year after his father had died. He himself had been diagnosed with tuberculosis. The Shostakovich family were hard-pressed to make ends meet, and the aspiring composer had taken a job playing the piano in the cinema for silent movies. His sister tells the story that Shostakovich and two friends rehearsed this trio in the cinema as an accompaniment to film. Composed as a single movement, the trio is in sonata form with a pair of contrasted themes and a development section. And what is particularly striking is how Shostakovich develops his first theme, drooping semitones, becoming something altogether spikier, hinting at those grotesque moments in the later works, Shostakovich the ironist. The romantic second theme, which began life as part of an uncompleted piano sonata, seethes with youthful yearning. Then, after a particularly dramatic development, the two themes recur, but in reverse order. We can perhaps hear this trio as dramatising the two contrasting musical choices that lay before the budding composer, at least in the culturally free air that you were allowed to breathe when Lunacharsky was Commissar for Culture. There is the Russian late Romantic tradition, still so present in Petrograd in the person of Alexander Glazunov, director of the Conservatoire. And then there is the bracing wind of modernity, with its sceptical tonality and Stravinskyan fascination with rhythm. In the event, we know which path Shostakovich would follow. It led farther away from Glazunov and Rimsky-Korsakov, and his preoccupation took him to the music of Mahler and Berg, and an admiration and a scarcely hidden rivalry too with his fellow Russian composer Sergei Prokofiev. By the time that Shostakovich came to compose his first cello concerto in 1959, Stalin was dead, and Nikita Khrushchev had denounced the dark days of his tyranny at the 20th Party Congress. Prokofiev's Symphony Concerto from 1952 was evidently the piece that spurred Shostakovich on to write his concerto in 4 movements for Mstislav Rostropovich. And if the work begins on a sarcastic note before embracing melancholy and darker thoughts too, it apparently ends on a cheerier note. But, and somehow there's always a but with Shostakovich, the opening theme of the finale is a cunningly disguised quotation from a Georgian folk song, Suliko, which just happened to be Stalin's favourite tune. Not even Rostropovich spotted the melody until it was pointed out to him. Stalin was dead, but the dictator lives on. Shostakovich's final composition is the Sonata for Viola and Piano Opus 147, composed in 1975. Shostakovich must have known that this would be his last work when he began to compose it at his summer dacha in Zhukovo. Late in June, he telephoned the viola player, Fyodor Druzhizhin, to tell him about the sonata and to ask his advice on technical matters relating to the viola. There were frequent phone calls, and in one of them Shostakovich described the piece. The first movement was a novella. He announced the second a scherzo and the third an adagio in memory of Beethoven. But, he is reported as saying, don't let that put you off. Above all, the music is light, bright and clear. The score was completed before the composer entered hospital for the very last time. He died on August the 9th, 1975, having never heard this sonata. At the first public performance in October, the audience in the small hall of the Leningrad Philharmonic gave the musicians Fyodor Druzhinin and Mikhail Muntian a standing ovation as Druzhinin held the score of this last work above his head. A last work. So should we hear it in the context of that special category that we devise for last works? Rembrandt's late self-portraits, Titian's Ovid pictures, Shakespeare's final romances, Beethoven's last quartets. Has the style become freer? Is this music that looks ahead to something that can only be dimly perceived in old age at the end of a great creative career? Or is this sonata a last attempt to hold together the lessons that he had chosen to learn at the hands of the tyrant about being his own man and a loyal son of the Russian Revolution? The moderato first movement begins agreeably enough with a light-stepping pizzicato theme for the viola and then an almost cosy dialogue between the two players. Then a middle section, all triplets, darkens the tone. There's fear in the viola's relentless marching and some kind of pain in the agitated accompaniment. But what are we to make of the ghostly, glassy sound with the viola playing sul ponticello close to the bridge of the instrument, before a short cadenza toys with some of the themes of the novella, and the movement ends with the viola pizzicato that we heard at the start of the movement. The allegretto, which borrows material from Shostakovich's unfinished opera The Gamblers from 1942, bounces along, refusing to take anything too seriously. A last laugh, perhaps, that seems to fade into the distance. Then, gathering itself, the movement embarks on a rollicking Russian dance that appears to exhaust both viola and piano. The final adagio, the longest of the three movements, finds its way to an unmistakable reminiscence of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. All is solemn as we seem to hear the tolling of a bell. A short cadenza halfway through the movement ends in a fortissimo shout, and memories of Beethoven fade as the final pages of the sonata seem to look death, or is it fate, or is it both, straight in the eye. A final rocking theme, and a third time the sonata fades away in C, with the viola having one last word before the rest becomes silence. So, is this a man staring death in the face, railing too at his fate? Perhaps. Or should we perhaps pay closer attention to the Russian themes of the allegretto and to that souvenir of Beethoven in the adagio? Is this a response to the anguish of the opening novella, a response to oppression? Then, in the 1930s, a Soviet composer was required to be Russian, but now bureaucracy has replaced tyranny. The danger has passed, and a composer like Shostakovich can look west again to Beethoven, an apostle of personal liberty and freedom. Fanciful, perhaps. But we are never in any doubt about what is happening, even if we cannot be exactly certain what it means. And that perhaps is a legacy of the terror, the dread and the fear that was visited on Dmitri Shostakovich during Stalin's tyranny. As a Soviet composer, his voice must be clear, but it could also be his own voice. And in speaking for himself, he could speak to and he could speak for others.